This brief presentation on the literary elements in The Imperfectionists by Tom Rockman will help you to understand this week's reading assignment so that you can discuss it in depth in our 2 discussion forums. You must use at least one direct quote from the literary work and at least one direct quote from a literary expert in the 4 discussion posts that you write. The recommendations for further study folder will help you start your research this week. Let's begin the presentation with the author's background. Tom Rockman was born in 1974 and he grew up in Vancouver. He graduated from the University of Toronto and the prestigious Columbia School of Journalism in New York. The Imperfectionist, his first book, won many awards, including the New York Times Book Review Notable Book of the Year, which is a prestigious award, especially for a first novel. Rockman has a perfect background for writing about an international newspaper because he worked as a foreign correspondent for the Associated Press in Rome and as editor of the International Herald Tribune in Paris. He lives in London now, where he works on his second novel. The places that are important in the book mainly are centered around the newspaper office in Rome, but there are other settings in Rome and Paris, including a commercial airplane for one of the stories. Restaurants and bars are also important. The settings in many ways resemble what we see in The Sun Also Rises. The time is 1940s to the present. The lifestyle is expatriate and alienated. The family relationships resemble those in the workplace. There's a lack of commitment. There's no connection between the people. And the work ethic is conflicted. They want to keep this newspaper going, even though it's a failing newspaper. It's always struggled, and through the years, especially as it ends, it gets even worse. Each of the stories has a main focal point, a main character, but the other characters may appear in other stories. Lloyd Burko is the Paris correspondent in the first story. Arthur Gopal is the obituary writer who is then promoted because he gets to write cultural reviews after the death of his daughter. Hardy Benjamin is the business reporter. And Herman Cohen is the corrections editor. Kathleen Solson is one of the editors-in-chief. Winston Cheung is a Cairo stringer, and he's the one who loses the laptop to the older man who's more savvy at getting his competition to fail. Ruby Zaga is the copy editor. Craig Menzies is the news editor. Ornella Di Monterecci is the reader. She's the one who saves all those newspapers. Abby Pinola is the chief financial officer, and she's the one who has to fire the employee who becomes very angry on the airplane. Oliver Ott is the publisher. He's not the original publisher. That would be Cyrus Ott. And Cyrus Ott originally starts the story by trying to hire a woman that he was interested in at one time, to hire her and her husband so that he can make a connection with the woman. The themes are obviously the death of the newspaper, which we see in our society today. With so many people using the internet, subscription newspapers are failing. There's also a theme of isolation versus alienation. Which characters are merely isolated, but they will reach out. For example, Lloyd Burko to his son who loses his job because he can't speak the French language. The father and son were isolated from each other, but they weren't really alienated. And impermanence of passions, that comes from the literary expert Christian house. So these people become passionate about something, but it doesn't last very long. Obviously, there's a theme of office politics. And technology's effect on society is a huge issue. We see that in the opening chapter when we see Lloyd Burko struggling to keep his job even though he's pretending to use the email and the internet, but he's struggling with it. The plot is somewhat complex because you have 11 different but related stories. The first of the 11 different stories begins to tell the story about the rise and fall of an international newspaper run by Americans living in Rome. And this story begins in Paris with an aging correspondent, and that's Lloyd Burko. The story shifts to Rome, where an American publisher starts the newspaper so that he can hire a married woman and her husband because of his attraction to the woman. There are different employees telling their stories about what it is like to work on a failing international newspaper through the decades. The story ends with the newspaper going out of business under the leadership of the original publisher's reclusive son. There's a lot of symbolism. It's probably not quite as symbolic as you would get in The Sun Also Rises. In fact, I'll say definitely it isn't. But still, you need to do some research and some critical thinking. Characters can be symbolic. For example, Lloyd Burko, the Parisian correspondent, symbolizes the generational gap that creates a sense of isolation between older and younger employees. Settings can also be symbolic. For example, the empty mansion that Cyrus Ott lives in when he relocates to Rome. He leaves his family in Atlanta, which Atlanta is also where CNN, Ted Turner's international news network, is located as well. So there's a connection. I believe Rockman was probably inspired by Ted Turner's success, and you will be writing a paper that makes a connection between not only two books, but also our real world and the novels. So Cyrus Ott lives in this mansion when he relocates to Rome, and the mansion symbolizes the disconnected way that he and others interact socially in the novel. The point of view and the writing style is interesting, and I believe it's easier to read than, say, All the Names by Jose Saramago. Writing in the third person, Tom Rockman describes an unnamed, second-tier international newspaper headquartered in Rome and run by a motley cast of miserable Americans. And that quote comes from Paul Barrett. The omniscient narrative voice remains the same as 11 different stories are told. And as I mentioned, there's 11 stories. The characters appear and reappear, so you do need to keep some good notes on this. And the recommendations for further study folder will help you start your research on this interesting novel. Of course, if you have any questions, please let me know.